Hey guys, Jason Hettler here, and I'm joined by Ed. Ed or Edward? It's Ed, right? But
You can get my wife calls me Edward, so you can go with Edward.
well, your formal Skype name here says Edward, so I guess that's what threw me off. But
Yeah,
I've only
let's go Ed. Yeah.
Ed Leah. Which one is it?
Lee.
Just
Imagine it go with like if you took L out of the way and put S, it would be C, like you'd be by the seaside, wouldn't you?
That's how you justify having an A in there, huh?
Yeah, I mean, if I get a cold caller and they ask for Mr. Leah, it just gets bang hung up straight away.
My middle name is Lee, but it's Lee. Which
L-E-E here is always like either a first name. Well, I guess it's mixed in with the Leigh as well, but you don't have that in America, do you?
A little bit, kind of like, sort of like Kaylee. Like I know a Kaylee. So on the ending of something a little bit longer, it'd be Leigh. But not so much as a standalone. If that makes sense.
This could be the longest I've spoken about my surname for, though. But
I think if anybody was going to tune into this, we've already lost them. So
yeah,
we can approach the rest of this conversation as if it's.
And they still won't know my name, so I'm going to get no bad credentials from it. It's just you personally.
So start again. Hi, I'm Jason Hettler, and I'm joined by Ed Lee.
Perfect.
A British man.
English.
Yeah, an English man.
Jeez.
Now we're going to have to talk about this.
Yeah. Well, no, let's not talk about that. That's no.
All right. Maybe I'll just let you give a quick little intro and background to who you are, because I clearly have no idea.
Yeah, no, it's disappointing. Work for Quins at the moment, or Harlequins, which is an English Premiership rugby side. Been doing that now working for them for coming up to 7 years, I think, something along those lines. And my current role is probably like a 60-40 split, 60% looking after any of the long-term injured players, which is essentially what we would class as 6 weeks or longer, surgical or non-surgical. And then the other 40% of my job is looking after the backs. So I don't know how many Americans will watch this, but in terms of from the quicker guys in the rugby field. So looking after their speed, power, strength, fitness. And I kind of co-run that with Gaz Tong, who's our head of athletic performance. So we run that together and write the programs together. And then previously, I kind of started this whole strength and conditioning thing 10 years ago, doing an internship with Harlequins, and then left there and worked for a rugby league side called London Broncos, did the academy there, and then travelled to New Zealand, where I worked for an ITM team, which is essentially their provincial side, rugby side out there, and it was a team called Northland. So I was their assistant S&C out there. And then that's kind of led me into Harlequins, and that's really where I am, really. Yeah.
Awesome. Very well said. I couldn't have done that. Today, we figure we'll kind of gear the conversation around periodization. And if it takes the form of any of the previous conversations we had, we might get completely off topic and go down some rabbit holes, but it doesn't bother me at all.
No, absolutely fine with that. Kind of my experience has always been that when I first started, it was so structured and rigid, and it just really never worked. And it's not like that. It's like they don't need to start that 12-week preseason with that huge block of hypertrophy, because they're professional athletes. They've had 6 weeks off, but those 6 weeks firstly, they haven't lost a huge amount of cross-sectional area. They haven't come in looking like marathon runners. Most of them like lifting to stay vain, so they kind of maintain that size anyway. So all it is making sure that you integrate the rugby correctly in the running volume. And I think the weights is a whole nother ball game that doesn't need to be blocked like boom, boom, boom. So that's kind of a very long-winded way of kind of showing where I thought periodization started and finished for me, really.
Maybe the thing I'd like to start with is you mentioned traditional periodization as being null and void.
Yeah.
And is that purely based on, for some of the reasons that you said, in terms of not needing to start with a hypertrophy block and stuff like that, or is there any more to it?
Yeah, so for me mainly it's the kind of it's the unknowables within the seasons. So let's take athlete A, and I think preseason if you go back to preseason, it's a period where you can work on everything. Like a guy comes in, I walk in, and the coach or the S&C coach says, right, you need to be ready to play rugby in 12 weeks' time. If you thought of it like that, I don't think you would spend a third of your time working on just one quality within physical preparation. So what I don't know where that kind of came from. So you look at like, right, you can have different demands on different days. So you might start off the week, and this probably would flow into our weekly kind of structure. But you'd have kind of when they haven't done a huge amount over Saturday, Sunday, the day's not going to be massive. So it's a good chance to get some higher repetition work in, encourage some blood flow, maintain or improve a bit of muscle mass. Then towards the middle block of the week, when you're kind of getting fired up and getting going, that's where you do your larger or higher demand work. And then towards the end, you probably you can still keep it relatively high or moderate, but you just got to be sensible and realize that they've probably had 3 or 4 days in a row of a decent amount of running, rugby, and lifting in some form. But I think it's just sensible planning week by week. And that's how a preseason should flow. Personally, I think that's how it should flow. Obviously, you're going to have a structure, but I don't feel it's the block structures that within rugby 10 years ago was prominent. That was how it was set out. And then within the season, in terms of why I feel it's slightly null and void, is that the unknowables, as I said. So you've got your second choice centre or second choice fly half, whatever. And all right, okay, cool. We know that he might get out of the next 7 games, he might get two starts, a couple times off the bench, but that means actually his general running or his general load or volume of game time throughout the week is going to be lower. So we can work on some attributes within the gym. We're going to plan this nice little wave or increase of a version of 5-3-1 or whatever your kind of poison is. Use that, and then the first game, the first choice fly half gets injured, and all that goes out the window. And then he's playing every single day for the rest of the season if it's a bad injury. That's for me. That's why. Firstly, it's a waste of time, in my opinion, to sit down and write a whole block, a whole season, or periodize a whole season surrounding what you think is going to happen, because it will never happen in rugby. People have a 54-man, 55-man squad for a reason, and that reason is because injuries happen. So therefore, I think you have to take it week by week, but also knowing what somebody's important qualities are that they need to improve.
The challenge for me is trying to strike that balance between structured and flexible. And I think some of the more recent literature kind of separates it out between periodization and planning. And your planning can be very flexible, but you still have this umbrella that sits above it all as a periodization, which I think could make sense, but it almost begs the question for me of that: how much do you concern yourself with that overarching umbrella, and how much do you just focus on the planning and kind of layering that together and piecing that together?
I think if you're as a coaching cohort, if you're in tune enough with each other and you respect each other's opinions enough and all that stuff, I reckon the planning week by week can be so flexible, because everybody understands you're working towards the end goal. Especially, I'm talking mainly team sports, because obviously they realise that everyone needs to be available to have the best team. You need all players to the non-starters to be competitive towards the starters, and etc. etc. So as long as everybody knows that you're working towards a goal, of having everybody available, I think that helps with the planning of their physical preparation from all aspects. I think that's the flexibility comes from coaches working together well, and then and as you said, it's ridiculous to think that you could write down a full yearly, weekly, monthly, or not weekly, but a monthly structure, and it's just going to stay in place and work perfectly. I think that's
for everybody, just because the individual.
Exactly.
It really brings that individual component to light in an individual sport. I think when there's all these differences in the structure of the season and priorities, and then you have an international group, so it makes it hard ultimately to fit everybody to one periodization model, or at least to the planning that comes within that to keep that kind of consistent.
An interesting one for us that's happening in England at the moment is the Premiership finals are happening this weekend, and it's Wasps versus Exeter. And Wasps have had 9 COVID cases, I think it is. So last week they had no training whatsoever. Nobody was allowed in their facility. Nobody was allowed contact. So actually, you could look at that, and I was chatting with one of the other coaches today. So that could be an invaluable period that no team does a week, 2 weeks before a final, or 2 weeks. No team ever goes, go away, and let's not have any interaction, and let's not chat, let's not train, let's just leave it. It could be an amazing time for these guys to not think about the biggest game in their career. Granted, they're going to think about it, but as a group, they're not going to get all kind of wound up. And if you have a shit session, it's not going to kind of make the next 3 or 4 sessions more valuable and more intense. So I think there's a lot to be said throughout a year, especially yours, where you could have them in so early and then not compete for, say, like 8 weeks or so. There could be an argument to say, right, go away for a week, 2 weeks, do the bare minimum, and then come back, but just don't come in the facility. I think that year when they first come in, where you know they're not going to play, unless there's some super talented guy that gets thrust in the mixer, and we've had 2 of them in the past, 10 years. Everybody else is going to have a period where they're in a professional environment for the first time, having everything given to them, they're not being asked a lot. And I think that's a key thing. People are just saying, look, develop. Fuck, you've got 3 years in this contract, this academy contract. Who cares if you're not the best rugby player in the first year? Nobody's expecting you to come in and be a starter. Nobody wants you to be a starter.
It's an amazing opportunity, it seems, to take a little bit of a longer term perspective and approach that you're just not always afforded that luxury. I think oftentimes you're not, or oftentimes it's at least chosen not to take that route.
Yeah. One thing I would also, going back to say, sorry to interrupt, when you jokingly said, oh, would you go West Side or Conjugate at the beginning? I wouldn't do any of that shit. One thing I would, though, is try and increase their library of exercises, not in a CrossFit way, not in a weekly way, but just at a point where when they get to 27 and 28, and inevitably if you've played professional rugby, you're going to have some niggles, you're going to have a shitty wrist, your neck's going to hurt, you're going to have a crappy hamstring. Something's going to be there. You must have been a dreadful player if you get to the end of your career and you're absolutely fine. But the amount of times we've spoken with players, or especially within the injured setting, where somebody has never done a simple exercise before, or they can't do it, or they're having to learn something. And it's not a necessarily bad thing when you're at the end of your career and you're having to learn something. But if you go into, let's say you're 22, and there's not an exercise in the gym that you haven't at least tried, doesn't mean you have to do every single one of them. Doesn't mean you have to stick by it and know how to snatch or overhead squat. But at least if you've given it a go and you're aware of it, that's another string to your bow that you can kind of tug on later down the line when you're kind of just plateauing out a little bit and you go, right, well, I've track bar deadlifted for 3 years. We've conventional deadlifted before, so we know that it's not going to fuck you up. You're constantly playing, but we can throw that in, and that's something else that can maybe take you a little bit further. And that's one thing that I would make sure I do with the academy players, and give them a decent library of exercises under their belt.
I think that's a great point. From a coach's perspective and from an athlete perspective, I just imagine that it provides so much information, for them to know. I think it's important for them to know what they like and what they don't like, and to know, do I not like it because I'm bad at it, or because it doesn't make me feel good, or I'm just weak, or I just don't really like it for no real reason, and to know the things that they really do like, and then I think it just provides more information around for when those niggles are up. What do I feel comfortable doing, or what can I do, and what can I do? And I want to get your take on. So there's a paper that came out August 2020 around periodization, and I don't know. I don't know if I could say it was directly in response to some of Kylie's stuff. I think it's maybe more indirect is probably the better term because it's probably more all-encompassing than that. But I'll read a couple of sentences from it and get your take on it. It says, we unanimously feel that today's students and young scientists are developing in a climate that is too focused on self-promotion and too often misses the big picture. Over the last several years, we have had many reviews and opinion papers on periodization, which we feel the questioning is far too simplistic. For example, questioning a reference statement or using a circumscribed thought process more common in the basic sciences and misses the breadth and robustness of the argument. Would you agree or disagree with that or those or some of those statements?
I agree. I don't think you can. I don't think you can help but agree with some of them. I feel it's hard. I always find those papers on periodization hard to kind of get my head around because it's such an individual thing. If we're using the term periodization, for me, it's such an individual thing that I don't think you can say one is right or wrong. And I know I've just sat here and said one is wrong, but that's because I'm saying it's wrong for this environment. Whereas I believe that in some environments, the accumulation or the intensification, that style of work or high-low or a conjugate work in some system, if you've got a powerlifting school or club, whatever they're called, then yeah, perfect. Conjugate might work. Brilliant. And I always find, so I tend, yes, I agree with a little bit of that, but I also feel it's hard to fully agree or disagree with anything that's written about periodization, really, because it's too individual to the player or the athlete or the coach or the environment. I know that sounds like a bit of a wishy-washy answer, to be honest, but
so let's talk a little bit more about Kylie, I guess, because you know, they were directly talking about some of his stuff, and there's a couple of quotes out of I think these are out of his most recent, which is the Inconvenient Truths paper, but I'll just read them off. Training variation is a critical component of long-term planning, but if adaptive energy is too widely distributed, gains may be excessively diluted. So kind of finding that balance between variation and not distributing too widely.
Yeah.
And then the other one, repetitive application of a unidimensional training stress may induce rapid improvements in a limited range of targets, but if such concentrated focus is unduly prolonged, the athlete will be exposed to the negative effects of unremitting monotony.
Yeah.
So very, very much in line with the same topic. And one reason I chose both of these, and I'm kind of glad, I'm going to forget exactly what you said, but you know, in my mind, a lot of what Kylie's come out around periodization is more just about kind of here's some thoughts. Now think critically about it.
Yeah.
You know, to me, the way I read it, at least, he's not necessarily saying the old way is wrong. This is the new way, and this is the way to do it. To me, it's more maybe just poking some holes and kind of some traditional viewpoints and thoughts on periodization, and then highlighting some pieces of information that I think are probably pretty important to consider. And then again, in my mind, kind of leaving it up to the reader to figure out how these pieces fit together and what it actually means for periodizing in your circumstance.
Yeah, I think his papers, or whatever he's in, should almost be a mandatory waiver when you buy an NSCA manual or a Chansky manual. And it's just like, right, sweet, you've read this, brilliant, fantastic, you've taken it on board, and there's a lot of place where this could be applicable. However, take a moment, calm yourself down, read this, and then realize there are other factors other than lifting or other than your world of strength and conditioning, and realize there's more than also just the sport. Because that was one of the big things. Everyone goes, oh, yeah, you can't focus too much on strength and conditioning. They've got to play rugby. Like, yeah, okay, fine. Now we all realize that now. They've also got a kid that's not sleeping. They've got a wife that is demanding of them, rightly, because they're like, you've got a family here as well. You're not just a rugby player, you've got a family. So they have to deal with that, quite rightly. And then you've got their career or their career post their rugby career that they might be thinking about. So you've got all these emotional ties here and there, and then you might have a little injury here, and then that's another emotional tag on, and sponsors asking you to do this, and blah, blah. And it's not all negative. Sometimes there's a massive positive where you're like, right. And actually, this is the other thing I meant to get across. Everyone always thinks about like the negative emotional effects. They always go, fucking think about this and this and this. But sometimes, let's say you're a 23-year-old and you get called up for England and you're there in 5 or 6 weeks. You're like, fuck, right. He's on an absolute high. Let's make the most of this. Let's make him enjoy his training. Let's get the most out of him. Work on the things that you want to work on. Work on the things you need to work on. Because he's going to work fucking hard for this period because he's going into England for the first time. So use a positive emotional push rather than always being like, let's go to plan B. Let's always have a plan B and do this and do that. Maybe let's have an A-star plan where you're like, fuck, Jesus, they're way ahead of where I thought they were going to be. Or they're gassed up on getting chosen for England. So they're just going to go as hard as he can. Let's make the most of this. He's going to do everything. He's going to really buy into what we're doing because he's realised it's got him here and blah, blah, blah. So I might have gone off topic there, but yeah.
Oh, it's great. It's really insightful, and it's, you know, that's the kind of stuff that you're not going to get out of the textbooks or traditional periodization resources, because that deviates from what a structured periodized plan would be. But take advantage of those serendipitous moments and those various scenarios, I think.
Great use of the word serendipitous. Great use.
I was just waiting to try to fit that in. Now that it's there, I could probably
see
wrap
word
this
of
up.
the day calendar in the back.
A lot of what you said is right in line with path dependence, which I think it's Kylie who highlights it in one of those papers, or at least somebody does, in regards to periodization. And it's really just speaking to this lack of critical thinking and the fact that it's taken this path over the last however many decades that it's gotten to the point where oftentimes we just assume that it's correct and right, and that it's rooted in all the right foundational underpinnings because it seems like it would make sense. But it's been on this path for so long and it's developed so much steam that we then forget to think about what are those underpinnings that may have been updated in the last 50, 60, 70 years,
yeah,
and which ones have stayed pretty constant over that time, and how does that change things, if at all? How does sport calendars change things? And it just very much speaks to that idea of path dependence, I think.
I mean, we've spoken about it loads about Charlie Francis, and he's the classic. He is the classic where people take what he says as gospel, and unfortunately, the guy isn't around to say, "Whoa, hold on, this has just worked for me." Because and I know we've spoken in some negative, some positive ways about the guy, but it is what it is. Like he's written his structure for his environment. Yet it seems like it's an unwritten rule that nobody can speak bad of the guy, or nobody can speak bad of the system. And people will go like, "Well, we're going to use his tempos. We're going to do his high-low process, and don't even think about talking back because that's what I'm going to be doing."
Yeah.
Well, Jesus, you have some context. First of all, it was back in the 80s and 90s, so we might have progressed a little bit from then. And also, he's got his own, as you say, his own path. But don't blindly follow him. You're not a lemming. Make your own mind up. See what you can take from him. Hey, you might decide that you're 80% as close to his as anybody else would be. Be it another environment might be wildly different, and that process or that philosophy just doesn't fit.
I feel like another quote from Kylie kind of might sum it up and kind of round it out a little bit. So here we go. We need, for example, to navigate between planning rigidity on one hand and a formless lack of training direction on the other. We need a structured training framework, yet one that is flexible and tolerant of change. We need goal-directed coherence, but simultaneously must facilitate seamlessly consistent course corrections in response to dynamically emerging information.
I actually think that was one of the paragraphs that I read. I remember reading, and I read it a couple of times because it's a decent mouthful. And then I sat back and I was like, that makes complete sense to me.
It presents the dichotomies, kind of the balancing act that we're striving for, and it it's not going to tell us how to do it. We don't know exactly how. There's no one way or right way to do it, but I think that encompasses what we need to be and should be striving for
Yeah.
around the idea of periodization and planning and programming.